May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. As I was preparing this sermon, sitting at my desk with a laptop, and I read Jesus' words in the Beatitudes, a stray thought of an old movie crept into my consciousness, Life of Brian. In that story, Jesus was talking to the crowds, teaching the Beatitudes, and a Mrs. Gregory had trouble hearing him. She asked her husband what Jesus had said, but a spectator said, "I think he said, 'Blessed are the cheesemakers.'" I read the Gospel of St. Matthew and went through all the list of those who are blessed. Some of them seemed like the most unlikely characters: the poor in spirit, the meek, the contrite, those who mourn, those who hunger and thirst to be good and upright people, those who are abused. It's strange how the words of Scripture can travel, and these blessings in particular have made an amazing journey. Now, in the last 3 verses of the previous chapter before this gospel, Matthew tells us that Jesus was drawing great crowds. It says, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. And his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, from the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. So he probably was outrunning them. He left the crowds of people, went up the mountain, and sat there with his disciples, and he began to teach them. Many people have looked at this sermon of Jesus, and they look at it as a complete restructuring of how we ought to be as Christians. It's amazing how these bits of wisdom, echoed from that craggy rock, have passed down from generation to generation. These words were rolled into brittle parchment and hidden in caves. These letters have been etched on animal hides so that their pungent smell of leather would rise as men and women read them. These syllables have been bound in heavy books, stored in monasteries, and placed gingerly in holders. These words have been passed down in small tracts, left fluttering on the street corners, trampled underfoot. These words come in red and green fonts or on onion skin paper. These words have been laminated in plastic. These words have been framed. Sometimes you can still find words in the drawers of hotel rooms. And now I was looking at these words on my laptop, scrolled through them in an entirely different manner. These holy messages have been translated and passed down. As a small child, I remember chanting them over and over again in the hopes of winning a gold star from the sister. I did get one. The words were handed over from one language to the next as scholars debated the interpretation of the syllables. These echoed words of Jesus have been whispered and shouted, have been copied and hidden. They have traveled to us from that sermon thousands of years ago to here and now. These words travel to us. These Beatitudes that we learned as children, this meditation that we often heard on Sunday. Although they have been an intimate part of our lives, I believe we can hear them differently now. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn. These 6 simple syllables seem to stand out straight from the screen, and they had their hands raised. They were begging for attention. I was thinking about some friends who recently were mourning. For the first time in my life, these words were not benign words of hope that should be written in pastel letters on a religious bereavement card. These words are alive. These words are active. These words are audacious and bold. Blessed are those who mourn. My blood boils at the outrage of these words, though. I think of the war-torn streets in Saigon suburbs. I think of the riot-torn streets in downtown Cairo today and all around Egypt. 17 or more people killed, leaving loved ones behind. I think of the parents dying and leaving their children too early. I think of a mother burying her child. How could Jesus say there's any sort of blessing in this emotional upheaval? How could Jesus call that mother, who has the aching grief seeping into her joints until she's paralyzed with exhaustion, blessed? I stared at these words. They looked different. Have you ever had a close friend or relative, perhaps someone on in years, in the hospital for surgery? Perhaps someone was out after the snowstorm, fell on the ice and broke her hip. She's going into surgery. Her whole body is so worn that there's a serious question about whether she will survive the operation. But she's in so much pain, there is no way to avoid it. You wait for a call from a mutual friend at the hospital to hear if the doctors will go through with the surgery, even with the risks involved. You also fear that that call may relay to you that this close friend or relative has passed away. You feel that painful, paralyzing sorrow, that mixture of anger and frustration that becomes so acute when we feel powerless. But there are these words, "Blessed are those who mourn." Why would Jesus say this? Some scholars say that those who mourn meant those who mourn from their sins. They connect Jesus' words with something in Isaiah. I don't follow that logic. I'm not sure the disciples made that connection either. So you're awaiting this phone call. You try to sit up straight. You hate to fall asleep and miss it, but your body longs for rest. You eventually do drift off, and yet awake, needing even more sleep. You're ready for this phone call. You've decided to be prepared for the worst. The feelings of sadness, of grief, of mourning, they're just so complicated, and a cacophony of feelings arise in you. You try to sort them out. And now we read what Jesus is saying, "You are blessed." Why would Jesus have the audacity to say that? Where is the blessing in this raw, open wound? Is the blessing upon those who mourn simply hinged on the future hope that they will be comforted? Or is there somehow a blessing in the midst of it? Is there some blessing in the grief and the sadness that washes over us? Of course, Jesus knew about grief. Even in this short gospel, he had come from healing. The crowd surrounded him. They pulled him here and there. And he saw the broken and the wounded. He saw the mothers with dying children and the children who had been left parentless. We know some things about Jesus that he felt in these circumstances. We know that when he healed, he could feel a bit of power leaving him. In Luke's gospel, it says, "Then Jesus asked, 'Who touched me?' When all denied it, Peter said, 'Master, the crowd surround you and press in on you.' But Jesus said, 'Someone touched me, for I noticed that power has gone from me.'" So when we read that Jesus bore the sins of the world, we can imagine how they weighed heavily upon him, the crushing burden of our cruelty towards one another. And in this moment, when the teaching rises up from him, I wondered, did it emerge from his powerless, burdening mourning? Did he